Welcome to Navi Sailor Learning Center. In this session, we are going to see about risk assessment concept. So, so I wanted to begin a risk assessment concept with an example. Let's say there is a ship, and the safety officer, and the safety officer, officer, the safety officer, he comes on the deck for inspection, and during the inspection, he found some ropes on the deck. Let's assume that this ropes on the deck. Let's assume that he finds a rope on the deck. So he thinks that this rope this rope is a possibility that somebody may trip and fall because of the rope on the deck. It's a loose rope, and even though they can slip and trip and fall, and also they can get an injury. So according to the concept of risk assessment in the code of safe working practices, the rope what we see here, what the safety officer has identified, that is an hazard. So what could the rope possibly can do? That means what the hazard can do. So what the hazard can do? The hazard can be any people walking on the deck. They can slip, trip, and fall. So they can get an harm. They can get an harm. The people can get an harm. So the hazard is a rope. It's a material. Hazard is a rope, and harm is a consequence for the people, like falling because of the rope, and they get injury. That is to the people. To the people, right? So the harm can be divided into two parts: likelihood and severity. So how a harm, how do you say the likelihood? That means the rope is on the deck. How likely a person can trip and fall? It's very likely. Or you may say that if rope is not there, he is not going to fall. That is unlikely. It's not going to happen. But whereas the rope is on the deck, if a person is going to walk, and he is very likely is going to get likely going to get fall and get injury. That is the likelihood. How frequently the situation is going to happen? How frequently? How fast it can happen? The hazard can happen on the deck. So it can. That is the likelihood. So why we are considering of the likelihood and severity? I will come to the next point. So the next point is we'll move on to the severity. What is severity? Severity is after a person falling because of the rope, and how severe is going to get injury. How severe is going to get injury? You see, the injury is very bad, or slight injury, or it's going to be a fracture, very serious injury. So that is the severity because of the hazard. Now, this likelihood and severity, they go and fall and one in one line, and that is called a risk factor. That is called risk factor. So let's say if my likelihood, I mean the harm is present here, and if my likelihood is very likely and my severity is high, then your risk factor also will be high. So that means what is the risk factor is telling me? The risk factor is telling me that if the rope is not going to be secured on deck, the people might slip and trip and fall. It can cause a very serious injury. That is the risk factor is telling. Risk factor is basically a nutshell of the hazard and the harm. So what is the consequence of the harm? So that is the risk factor. If the risk factor is very low, that is still okay. So how can the risk factor can be low? Let's imagine that instead of a rope, there is let's put a rugs on the deck. So if you put a rugs on the deck, first of all, it's not a hazard. So and let's say it's a nice sunny weather and it's a bulk carrier, you're going to put the racks on the deck, and during the sailing, it's not going to cause any harm, and the likelihood, nothing, severity, no, nothing, no, it's not going to cause any harm. So in that manner, the risk factor will be nothing, is zero, zero. So nobody is going to get harm because of the racks. So just I gave a small comparison so that you will understand the concept of risk assessment. So now I wanted to bring you with the risk assessment form in the code of safe working practices. You can see this form in the you can see this form on the left hand side where I mark arrow is all likelihood of the harm, how likely the harm is going to happen. So in our case where the rope was not secured is very likely it's going to happen, very likely. And severity of the harm, how severe, how the person is going to get extreme harm, is going to get very bad injury or a light injury. Let's say in our case, let's say we consider a person walking on the deck and he's slipping and falling. He has a a very serious fracture. Let's consider he's going to get a serious bone fracture. In that case, it's a moderate harm. In case if there is a very threat to his life and because of the rope his life is going to get lost, then it's extreme harm. So now we'll consider that there is a small fracture, it's going to get small fracture. In that case, the moderate harm. So you cross out that very likely and moderate, and you are still falling under the category of very high risk. This is a risk factor. This is a risk factor. This is a risk factor. That means what is the chart is telling me? The risk factor is telling me like if the hazard is present, if the rope is present, and if a person is going to fall, very likely is going to fall, and the consequence of the harm is very high. The risk factor is very high, and he may not be able to tolerate that. After he fall, after the bone injury, it may lead to the severe other complications and very serious. That is why the risk assessment chart is telling you always your risk factor must be very low or low risk. It must be very low or low risk. I gave you an example just just for an understanding. So if you are going to visualize in actual situation, some of the explanation possibly you might come up with a question how it's possible that he's having a injury and still we are considering as a moderate risk. I just gave an example for an understanding, right? I hope that we have cleared the concept of risk assessment, right? Now there are four types of risk assessment are mentioned in the code of safe working practices. First risk assessment is a first, second, and third and fourth. The first risk assessment, let's say, is a dynamic risk assessment. And task-based risk assessment. Toolbox risk assessment, and the other one is generic risk assessment. So the order may not be the correct, but still these are the four risk assessment mentioned the code of safe working practices. So let's first discuss about the dynamic risk assessment. So what is the dynamic risk assessment? Let's say you're on the deck, and you are going to the forecastle, and there is a possibility of some sea spray, some pitching. So immediately your conscious should think, oh, there is some danger. That is the dynamic risk assessment. You are carrying out the risk assessment in your mind according to the situation. You may not expect when you're coming out of the deck, there is a weather pattern changes in the forecast, or some strong wind or pitching or something like that. But as soon as when you come to the forecastle area, you see some changes is happening. So on board the ship, we cannot make a risk assessment. We cannot make a risk assessment for each and every step what we take in the onboard the ship. So what I mean is, like, we cannot take a risk assessment. You are going from cabin to navigation bridge, or you're going to galley, or you're going to the TT room. So the risk assessment can be taken for your jobs. I'm not saying denying the fact the risk assessment should be taken, but what I'm trying to put my point here is your dynamic risk assessment is like you are going somewhere and the situation changes. So you cannot call chief officer or a master to carry out the risk assessment for you. You have to carry out the in your mind dynamic risk assessment. Think what is going on around you and stop the hazard. Like what in that case, what you can do? In case of the weather, you cannot stop the weather. So please go back to the accommodation. That is a dynamic risk assessment. If you are going to stay in the forecastle area, obviously there is a possibility of some injury going to happen. That is the first type of risk assessment. Let's say second one is a task-based risk assessment. So what is the task-based risk assessment? Let's say you are carrying out a specific job in your ship. So let's consider that fitter and electrical officer, chief officer, they are going to repair the SATC antenna. The antenna is the clamp has damaged, rusted. They're going to install a new clamp. So they are going to do some specific top on the Monkey Island. So the vessel management have to take a risk assessment for based on the task. That is a task-based risk assessment. They have to identify all the risk associated with it. And the third risk assessment is a toolbox one. So toolbox one is like before starting of the job, you are going to discuss what are the risks associated with it and how you're going to deal with it. And you're going to ask the input from the members of the team who are going to involve in the work. So how they are going to tackle the risk in the job in the specific task. That is the one type of risk assessment. And the last one is a generic type of risk assessment. According to the ISM, every company they have an objective as per the safety management system. So the safety management system in the safety management system, what they have to do is they have to make a generic risk assessment for their ship's operation. The generic means bunkering operation, mooring operation, gangway rigging. These are common. The company might have hundreds of ships. All the ships the same. Gangway rigging. When they come to the pilot station, pilot rigging. So they have to feed in their SMS generic type of risk assessment that can be used as a template to cross check the risk which are there the present situation, and they can eliminate the risk. That is a generic type of risk assessment. So what I was talking about the task-based risk assessment, that is a requirement of merchant shipping. That is a merchant shipping regulation. So that is applicable for the UK vessels. And finally, what I would like to share in the end of the session is, so whenever you are going to take a risk assessment, so you have to first, whatever your company, let's consider that you're going to carry out an enclosed space entry. Let's say you're going to carry out the enclosed space entry. First, you need to follow your SMS, and your safety management manual or system will tell you what are the precautions you need to take if you're going to enter in the enclosed space entry. And you might have a template of RA, and you might have a checklist. You follow all these things, then you carry out a additional risk. Which is there anything present after eliminating the standard risk, standard hazards? You're trying to find out, is there any other additional risk is present? So that is the concept of the risk. The concept of risk assessment is like you have to embed in your mind that what are the risks involved in the task which I'm going to do. I have to avoid it. I have to do the job safely and come out of the job safely. That is the concept of the risk assessment. Thank you for watching, and please do subscribe to Navisailor Learning.com. Thanks.